Yeah, so thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, James, for asking me to present to you. I'll try to use my teacher voice since I've been out of practice for a while, but no, we have microphones now in the classroom, so it changes the game a little bit too. Let me know if audio is okay and we're good to go. So yeah, I'm president just for maybe another month still. I had my fill. I had a good run, I guess. And like Jennifer said, we're working on some collaboration. I think we need more of that, honestly, because we're so close to each other.
Yes.
And there's no reason why we can't have more interconnected activities and events, and so this year we were really fortunate to have a really excellent 4A chair. We ran almost 30 4As. We were doing like 3 a week, Wednesday, Friday, or Wednesday, Saturday, Sunday. And I think that there's kind of a two-edged sword with that, because now people know where to go. And which is fine, because we were taking them to areas that had good parking and they weren't really off the beaten path. But nonetheless, there's going to be more competition now. So I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but more people are getting into it, so it's pretty cool. I think, like Jennifer said, most talks that I've gone to, even with mushrooms, tend to be more physical science. All right, I'm a high school social studies teacher, and so I teach AP psychology, economics, civics, and I've taught just about every course in social studies we have. And so my interest in mushrooms really came from a ethno perspective. Okay, and when I got into mushrooms, I don't have a ton of physical science background, but once I started learning that, there's history, there's culture, there's all these connections, that really appealed to me, and it kind of encouraged me to start looking and identifying and get more involved with our club and all that kind of stuff. So my focus tonight is going to be more from a ethnomycology perspective, and I'll go into some of the details with that. I think the other side of it, we're going to talk about some psychoactive substances, right? And sometimes this is a little controversial, but where I'm approaching it is more from a historical perspective. And I try to present an objective viewpoint, because there is history, and there's a long history. And so knowing some of the roots of what they call the psychedelic renaissance that we're currently in is really, really kind of necessary, just to have perspective, because this stuff is here, right? So I always want to dedicate the talk to Dr. Manny Salzman. I don't know if anybody here knows or knew Manny Salzman. He was a longtime CMS member. He was actually the founding father of the Telluride Mushroom Festival. He lived to be just under 100 years old, and his passion for mushrooms was present everywhere. When I first started talking about my interest in ethnomycology, he actually photocopied some pages from a pretty rare book, Russia, Mushrooms and History, and gave it to me, the photocopies, so I could start my studies. And so I appreciate his efforts and all of his contributions. So just want to dedicate to him. All right. So I think mushrooms are having a moment right now. All right. Has anybody here not seen this film yet? Has everybody seen it? Okay. This kind of opened more people's eyes to what we do and why we're interested, and a lot of the different dimensions. And even if you've seen it already, it's worth revisiting, because there's a lot of details to pick up. And so the fact that we have all this information that's readily accessible and that people are interested in seeing is really kind of neat, because more people are getting excited and interested in what we do and why we're interested in this stuff. And so I think I'd give a shout out to your own club. And James shared a link with me that was a pretty neat connection to PMS, or PPMS, sorry, and not PMS, but and even the picture I like the picture that they included. There were two different sources, but it was cool to hear a Pikes Peak Mycological Society shout out in that.
Yeah, there were two different ones. There was the local one that ran,
yeah,
and then the nationwide NPR picked up the story, and then they altered it a little bit, and then they put it back out.
Yeah. Yeah, so it was, and I think the picture was from the local story, and then the NPR one just had the
That was
news.
from the actual 4A that we went on.
Yeah. And so, It's cool to see. It's cool to see more exposure, right? And so when I look around, you know, in a school, our school is about 2,000 students. And so, you know, you see a lot of different attitudes, a lot of different interests. I start to see more mushroom presence in the classroom even. And, you know, we see shirts. And some of them aren't exactly accurate, but, you know, and in all honesty, it probably violates the school dress code a little bit there. But I was a little conflicted because I didn't agree that the mushroom represented was psychedelic, but that's another story. But a lot of these students are wearing this stuff, and it's fashion, you know. And I even saw a student the other day, she had a Amanita muscaria necklace. And I said, well, have you ever seen that in real life? Or have you ever seen that mushroom? She's like, no. So I started showing her pictures, like, wow, I didn't know. And I explained the difference between the circles and the warts, you know, which you always see. But anyway, mushroom stamps. If you're familiar with Taylor Lockwood and his bioluminescent fungi photos, amazing photographer, mushroom photographer, period. But now we have U.S. postage that clearly shows the mushrooms. Mycoleather. A lot of new technologies are coming out that are replacing some of the things like real leather, right? And I think for now, a lot of these companies are targeting the luxury brands, and so I think eventually it'll trickle down into the more everyday items. But mycoleathers are a thing. All right, we know cultivation, and we know we have some cultivators here, and the fact that cultivation is becoming just more convenient. You know, and you can buy these at Home Depot. My wife picked one up for me at Target, you know, and so just the fact that you can grow your own mushrooms is for some people very appealing. All right, I'm sure people are familiar with all the different mushroom supplements and medicinal mushrooms. Every year I see more and more brands that are selling mushroom supplements for health, and there are truly health benefits, right? And then we have things like this, all right? Denver was the first city in the United States to decriminalize psychoactive mushrooms. All right, and I think for a lot of people I talk to, they still don't understand. That doesn't mean it's legal, right? It just means that it's not a high priority for law enforcement, and it's only Denver, right? Aurora, and I live in Thornton. It doesn't apply there. So, you know, but the fact is that, you know, every month you hear more and more cities, more and more locations that are starting to say, hey, we want to maybe encourage this. And even on our ballot this year, there's an initiative that I'll mention here after a while. And so I think the term psychedelic renaissance is coming up a lot. Now, I know this is becoming more and more mainstream when my mom is clipping newspaper articles for me and giving me, hey, this is mushroom stuff. And I'm like, did you read it? And then she is, you know. And so I know if my mom's aware of these topics, that more people are aware of this as well. And so these were some of the more recent ones that my mom clipped for me. The Washington Post just in April had a big article that dealt with medicinal uses or different clinical uses of psychedelics. Marco Pollan, anybody familiar with his work? Really eye-opening book. You know, help raise more people's awareness to what's going on and what's out there, and that has evolved into a series that you can see on Netflix as well. So his book, some of the same topics he covers in his book, he covers in the Netflix series. All right. So we know this stuff is happening now. All right, where I'm going with it and what I'm going to focus on for my presentation is really some of the roots of this psychedelic renaissance. And so definitely we're going to look at some of the historical perspective, mostly from the Mesoamerican pre-Hispanic cultures and their spiritual practices. We are going to look at Gordon Wasson and some of his contributions, and so the history for sure, but I want to say the herstory as well, because women had huge contributions in ethnomycology, and I think they're sometimes underappreciated because Gordon Wasson wouldn't have gotten into mushrooms if it weren't for his wife. You know, she was a Russian American, and she helped him understand that they're not bad, right? And then we'll also focus on Maria Sabina, who is probably the most famous figure when it comes to indigenous groups and psychoactive and spiritual mushroom use. All right. At the end of my presentation, I have a QR code if anybody wants it, and I'll share all my information freely. A lot of references that I had access to. You know, I was actually pretty fortunate during COVID. It was March 13th, 2020. I went to the University of Denver library, and I found some books. You know, there was a handful of books that I was interested in using, and because of COVID, I got to keep them for almost a year. So I thought that was kind of cool because it gave me a chance to do some research. And anyway, I'll share the resources that I have with you if anybody's interested. All right. So some of the key terms that we're going to focus on with this talk, Mesoamerica. And so some of the historical elements are kind of necessary. The concept of ethnomycology. And when we think of anything from an ethno perspective, we're talking about the human connection. All right. The term mycology, which may not be as familiar. I don't think it really became that popular, but we'll get into that. And even the concept of entheogens. All right. When was it you had Alan Rockefeller? Just a couple weeks ago?
A month.
About a month ago?
Right
And
after
so,
Telluride.
and so you're aware of his work, and he's a great collector, identifier, photographer. And so all the photos that I use, I'm attributed. I mean, he's the source of them. And I talked to him, and he said, I don't even care if you cite me. Just show them. You know, I thought that was pretty awesome because he didn't care. Just use the pictures.
He's afraid of
Yeah. And it's really neat to see people like that, or they freely give what they have and just want to share. So, all right. So as far as Mesoamerica, we're really talking about a region and a historical era, and for the most part, we're talking about southern Mexico into Central America. Okay, and so these areas were really where a lot of this early psychoactive mushroom use was taking place. All right, so we'll look at some of those things. The concept of ethnomycology. Gordon Wasson is kind of the founding father, in a sense, of ethnomycology, but ethnomycology deals with the social sciences and the humanities, and really just the human connections. All right, and so this quote was from David Rose. He's one of the contributing editor to Fungi magazine, but he writes a column that focuses a lot on ethnomycology. So ethnomycology is really the human side of mushrooms. All right. The term mycology, that's in the title of my presentation. I don't think this word really took off too well. It was created by Gordon Wasson, and really it more or less refers to spiritual and religious uses of mushrooms. All right. And so I think just the idea that he was seeing that there is a connection to spirituality and religion in different cultures around the world. But I don't think this term really became that popular. But mycology is something to be aware of. And so when you look at different indigenous groups, there's not a lot of artifacts, but there are artifacts that do have mushroom connections possibly. And from a historical perspective, we have to remember that some of this stuff was there before written records, and so we really don't know for sure if that's what they were. I think all mushroom enthusiasts and mycophiles will say if it looks like a mushroom, it is a mushroom, but that we really can't say for sure. All right. There we go. The concept of entheogen. It really translates into the idea of God, bringing God from within. And if you contrast this concept with a drug, drugs are used to get people high, right? An entheogen would be used for a ceremonial ritual purpose. And so a lot of it has to do with the mindset that a person's going into an experience with. But for an entheogen, it's more for a serious purpose. It's not a recreational purpose. And so I think when we look at some of these examples, we're looking at it from an entheogenic perspective, not a recreational or that perspective. All right. So just some physical stuff. I'm not going to go into a ton of background with the physical pieces, but I do think it's important to recognize the habitat, because in this region, the habitat is very diverse, and it does allow the mushrooms to grow. All right? And so we see varied habitat throughout the country of Mexico into Central America, and it's for that reason that you find a great diversity of mushrooms. One figure I came across, over 450 species of wild mushrooms are consumed in Mexico as food and medicine. And that's amazing just to think. I mean, that diversity is known and consumed regularly, you know. And so I don't know what the number is here in the U.S., but that's pretty impressive, right? This image was something that Gordon Wasson put out. It basically identifies areas where mushroom activity or mushroom use would likely have occurred. The thing I have to stress with the examples that I share, they shouldn't necessarily reflect everything. All right, when you look at this map, there's a lot of pockets, a lot of little areas, and when you look at the mushroom use on the Yucatan Peninsula versus further inland, you might see some variety. All right, a lot of the examples, like with Maria Sabina, they're pretty famous, but they shouldn't be considered as the standard, right? Because there's a lot of people out there, and we're talking about a 3,000-year period where there was a lot going on. All right, just some varieties. The genus Psilocybe is really the focus of the spiritual mushrooms. There are a lot of Psilocybe species. Not all of them are psychoactive, but many of these you will find in Mexico and Central America. And so Rockefeller put together a really cool poster that identifies some of these species, and you see some diversity, some really cool mushrooms. I think for all of us, these would probably fall into the category of LBM, little brown mushrooms. And so these are things you really want to be careful with. You're not likely going to find this much stuff, or this stuff at all, if you're lucky, in Colorado. Although I know Brian Barzee has found a species or a specimen or two. They just don't occur too much. But I'm going to show some of the different mushrooms and identify just some of the species that were used. All right, so Mexicana, the Latin names obviously were introduced later. I really am interested in some of the common names. And when you think about language, what people name things isn't necessarily a literal meaning. It might be more of a metaphorical expression. And so the little birds might represent the sounds that you hear when you take them, or what you see when you're under the effects of these. But this mushroom's a pretty famous one because it was the one that Dr. Albert Hofmann synthesized, or used to help synthesize psilocin and psilocybin. All right, and so Albert Hofmann, if you're not familiar, was the LSD chemist. He created LSD, and so he worked with people like Gordon Wasson and was able to synthesize the compounds that we know. Aztecorum, children of the waters. And some of these were a little more literal about the location where you're going to find them, but you do see a lot of references to the children. They refer to these as children. The landslide. This is a pretty potent one, and it is typically found in areas with disturbed landslide. Cubensis, probably the most familiar for a lot of people. This is the one that's probably the most cultivated illicitly, but the type specimen came from Cuba, as the name Cubensis comes from. The common name San Isidro refers to the patron saint of farmers and peasants, and so I thought it's kind of interesting that people would connect those. The religious connection, for one, with the mushroom. Zapotecorum. Anybody want to take a shot at that name? I've tried it. Yeah, yeah, the little bird sounds good, I think. But yeah, a really beautiful little mushroom. And even Gordon Wasson had one kind of named after him, but somebody else beat him to the publishing of it. But there's a Wassonii, and it was known as the Little Women. And
why was it known as Little Women?
Meliarcula. I think that translates as women. So some of it's Spanish naming, not necessarily indigenous naming. All right, so as far as the distribution, I think, again, just knowing that there were many groups of people historically that have used this stuff. And I think the other thing that's important to recognize, these practices are still happening, all right? And I know there is a certain element of tourism and people who go out there just for that purpose, but there's also traditional uses that are taking place in different regions of this area. And so this diagram just identifies some of the different species and the groups of indigenous people that would have likely used them. So there's a lot. And again, when we look at certain examples, that's only one example. It's like a case study. It's not a universal that happens everywhere. All right.
Could you read the names of the native people who use them? I can't.
Yeah.
Can you see?
No, and like I said, I'll share these slides. I mean, I'll share these, but some of the groups we'll talk about: the Mazatec, the Mixtecs, Nahuatl, which are the Aztecs. I mean, those are the more common ones. And yeah, the text on here is kind of small right now for me, but I'll share this stuff and you'll have access to these details if you want them later.
Okay, but I don't see Mayan, and it was on the map, a large section.
Well, yeah, and so I think the Mayan were actually kind of a collection of other groups as well, and so some of them were incorporated by the Mayans. So where they, with the governments that they had, there were a lot of intermixing, and they required to pay tribute, and they kind of held their own identities, but they were still part of the bigger group. So this just identifies indigenous names more than, I guess, the generic name in a sense. All right, so historically, I'm not going to go into a ton of history, but again, we're looking at about a 3,000 period stretch, and there's a lot of stuff that can happen over that period of time. And so anytime we look at an artifact or an example, it really is only a snapshot of one point of time, all right? Because over that period, even especially pre-Columbian, there was a lot of things that were going on, right? And a lot of things that weren't recorded. And then once the Spaniards came in, everything changed, and a lot of that stuff was discouraged and put away, right? So historically, we're gonna look at a few different groups. All right, the first one's the Olmec. Olmec, if you're familiar with some of the artifacts here, the big heads, right? Considered one of the first great civilizations. Not really a lot of written record of their belief systems or their use of entheogens or psychoactive substances. And a lot of the interpretations that are made from this era, from these groups, are based on artifacts that have been left behind, like this. And so this object is a whistle, and I think the connection with Amanita muscaria is something that comes up here. And even the shape and the size of the object in comparison to the mushroom form might suggest the effects of Amanita muscaria. And so the name Gaston Guzman, he's a well-respected mycologist and ethnomycologist, and so some of his sources is where I get these details from. All right, so we will look at the Maya a bit. And so the Maya were more the southeastern regions of Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula. As far as their civilization, they had a lot going on, right? A very diverse and complex government system, and so there were kings that ruled areas, but they also had outside groups that paid tribute to them to be under their support and to trade with them. So they have a lot of artifacts, a lot of impressive architecture, and there's also a lot of evidence that they had knowledge of plant and animal hallucinogens, right? And so definitely the mushroom, but also the frog or toad, and the water lily, all right? So the toad, I don't know if anybody's heard of the toad venom or not. It's not venom, I guess. It's secretions from the toad, but it's a psychoactive similar to something we call DMT, but it's a pretty intense psychoactive. Water lily is more of a narcotic, all right, kind of like an opiate, and so they had knowledge of these plants and fungi. And so I think some of the most famous artifacts that we do see from the Maya were the mushroom stones. And the question is, well, did they really involve mushrooms? All right? When you look at the form, you look at the shape, and even the fact that it's supported on a base, there's something special about these things. All right? And so we'll look at a couple different examples, of several different examples. The sad reality is there's not a lot of them still out there. All right? Most of these are in museums or private collections. I think I've seen the number as low as 350 of these still out there. They're very rare. And so when we look at these stones, I mean, there was something special, right? And whether or not they truly reflect a mushroom connection, there is a mushroom form. And even when we look at the facial expressions and the physical features of the individuals depicted, they're different, right? And we'll show you a couple different ones. This is a pretty famous one, and it's in a museum in Switzerland right now. I'll just show some of them. Now, some of these figures had very mythological creature connections, monkeys and jaguars, and even the fact that some of them had more of a practical use, that they were found with carving applications, or grinding application, not carving. And I'll show you one later that led people like Gordon Wasson to believe that they did have a mushroom connection. And so some of these animals were sacred, and when they're incorporated into that object, maybe there is something there. Some of these really stand out when you look at the physical features, right? This bottom right one, is that showing up? Is my cursor showing up? Let me see what is that? Let's do this. This guy. There we go. He's actually part of the Denver Art Museum collection. I've never seen it there, but all the references I've seen say that it's housed in the Denver Art Museum. But some things you see are dilated pupils, and that is a characteristic of psilocybin intoxication. Even the way that the mushroom is presented, it's handled with care. It's like, check this out, right? And so you wonder, is there something there? This object, how he's inverted, almost has the appearance of he's flying, right? And so you have to wonder if these postures, if these features were intentional, There are a few ceramic figures. And again, the question is that really a mushroom connection? I think so, but who knows? Get this out of the way. And so some of the research that I am citing does make pretty strong arguments that there are mushroom connections, considering the shapes and the forms and all that. There's another one in the Denver Art Museum. And so we see mushroom forms on the head, on the breasts. And every time I start, I look a lot on museum sites to see if they have examples of these things. This was one I came across that I'd never seen before, that I thought was really interesting. And you think of the posture that this individual has, and just the appearance on the face is almost like they're deep in thought or something.
The thinker.
What's that?
Looks like the thinker.
The thinker, yeah. And what's I don't know if I had the era, the year, but this was a really neat one. There's this one again. And so Guzman did reference this object and try to explain that it could resemble the effects of a psychoactive mushroom experience. All right, this last one was one that Gordon Wasson felt confirmed his idea that there was a mushroom connection. And the form here is of a young woman who's grinding, right, on a metate, I think is what they call it. And what he observed in one of the mushroom ceremonies that he attended was a young girl grinding mushrooms for the ceremony. And so he felt that confirmed his belief that there's got to be a mushroom connection. But again, who knows? All right, the next group, the Mixtec. When we talk about Maria Sabina, the region in Oaxaca is where her group is from. And so they're kind of an offshoot of the Mixtec. The Mazatec are offshoots of the Mixtec. And so we also have a pretty highly organized and developed society. They eventually became part of the Aztec Empire, so some of these groups got incorporated by larger groups that are more powerful. One of the artifacts that we'll look at that comes from this group are called codices. And codices are like books, not paper, but on animal skins, and they tell stories. We'll show you some examples of this. And so most of the codices that were found were really record of origin stories. All right. This is an image. I have some images that are touched up to kind of give better detail, but these are believed to represent a mushroom ceremony. And you'll see some of the detail when I show it a little bit closer. And some of the research that I came across confirms that this was truly a mushroom connection. All right. And so the way these codices were read, they start in the bottom right corner and they run counterclockwise. So the story involves some gods, and there's gods of agricultural items like corn. There's gods of mushrooms. All kinds of different gods that are basically explaining how they came to be. All right. And so this particular story shows the first emergence of the sun. And what I've highlighted here are some of the mushroom images. And I'll show better detail on blown up images of this. But we see a lot of mushroom involvement. Those are the mushrooms on their heads, mushrooms in their hands. And again, I mean, this is part of a creation story, so this is explaining how they came to be. And so at the end of it, the sun was created, and that's how that happened. All right. So the Aztec are the next one. The other term, Nahuatl, is another name you'll see if you look for Aztec information. Honestly, I had some challenges doing this research. Number one, I'm not an anthropologist. I'm a high school teacher. And so the history is vast. And I was more interested in the mushroom connections. But in order to start learning about that, I really had to do a lot of research. And so I will touch on just the brief history stuff, but I mean, I'm not an expert by any means. All right, so Aztecs were also a very advanced civilization, more urban than some of the others, a very strong agricultural community. One of the biggest, pre-Columbian estimates, that's a lot of people. They were polytheistic, and with a lot of magic and occult forces that were part of their belief system. And so they are considered one of the great civilizations as well. And so with their interest in the magic and occult, that also incorporated entheogenic use of plants and fungi. And so they would use some of these compounds to communicate with supernatural, and so they would use them to help determine when they should fight, when they should run, what's going to happen in the future, and so they were consulted as advisors. All right, this one kind of cracks me up a little bit. They said some of these hallucinogens would help lessen the pain before sacrifice, but I mean, just from what I've heard about mushroom use, that would probably be pretty terrifying to be under the effects of that while you're being sacrificed. But plant hallucinogens were an important part of their lives. And it's kind of important to consider or to know this as well, that there was a very specialized group of people that were allowed to use them, right? Not just, these weren't things that just the everyday people would use. They were specialized individuals in parts of the clergy, even though they weren't always the priests and those people, but they were the shaman in a sense. So some of the hallucinogens that the Aztec were used, peyote, and the thing you got to understand as well. I mean, this peyote, the cactus, does not grow in those regions, so they were importing this stuff from the north, right? I actually met a woman. She's an archaeologist. She actually works at Mesa Verde, and she was saying there's evidence even as far as Utah that they were, buying or trading in networks like that. So I mean, they were all over the place. They weren't just located in those southern areas. Datura, somebody familiar with this one? It's also called Jimson weed. I don't think it's not necessarily a psychedelic. It's more of I don't even know what you call it, a narcotic, a deliriant. Yeah, I don't think it would be a pleasant experience. Morning glory seeds, and these are connected or similar to compound. They have similar compounds to what's in LSD. So these are hallucinogenic. And then they have mushrooms. All right. And so the name that we see with the Aztecs is the name Teonanacatl, and that kind of translates into God's flesh. All right. And so those are the things that did have an important part of their rituals. And so, like I said, I mean, there were specialized individuals who would be able to work with these things, and the ceremonies and what they would do to help. Let's see. I'm going to skip through this a little bit more. But I think that the belief in this, the belief that these, there were valuable tools, that they would use these tools to help solve problems, to help figure out what they're doing, where they're going. Pretty important stuff. All right, so another artifact that we do see connected with the Aztec is more from a European perspective, and we call them codices. So different than the codexes of the other groups. These were texts that were written by some of the missionaries that were documenting the history and the culture that they were encountering. And so really we have a pretty good record of pre-conquest areas. And some of the most famous ones, the Florentine Codex, and I'm not going to try that one, but I'm going to read some excerpts from these because they give us kind of an image of what was happening with these mushroom ceremonies. All right, so this image here, I almost kind of liken it to propaganda, all right? And so if you had a missionary who was a Christian, right, and they encounter people who they view as savages who are taking these substances and going out of their minds, right, you might incorporate images of the devil, right? And so some images were drawn by the Europeans. I think there is one image that might have been drawn partly by the native in a European, but I'll show you that here in a bit. But the term Teonanacatl, this might possibly be the origin of the term magic mushroom. If you think of the Teo as the sacred or the divine, the Nanacatl or the Nacatl as the mushroom or flesh. We'll look at the Life magazine example, but that may be where the editors translated the term magic mushroom. All right, so some of these excerpts, I do want to read part of it, and what they detail in this case was the coronation of Moctezuma II in 1502. And so they talk about sacrificing, where was it here? And with the force of those mushrooms, they would see visions and have revelations of the future. And here's the European side of it, the devil speaking to them in that drunken state. And so from a more of an ethnocentric standpoint, you have Europeans trying to explain things they really don't understand, and they might see it as sacrilegious, when in reality these people are doing their practice, their spiritual practice. Here's another one, and just the darkened or the bolded areas, eaten raw and being bitter, they drink after them or eat them with the little bees' honey. And while later they would see 1,000 visions, especially serpents, and as they would be out of their senses, it would seem to them that their legs and bodies were full of worms, eating them alive. And again, from a European standpoint, they just don't understand what was happening. They've never seen that before. Another account, they only drank chocolate during the night, and they ate the mushrooms with honey. And these are things that people still do with mushrooms. They take them with honey or preserve them in honey, and they consume them with chocolate. When the mushrooms took effect on them, they danced and then they wept. But some, while still in command of their senses, entered and sat there by the house on their seats. They danced no more, but only sat there nodding. And then one last one. He then saw all in vision, even that he would be drowned. And when the effects of the mushroom had left them, they consulted among themselves and told one another what they had seen in vision. And so I think you really get a sense here that they were at least acknowledging that there was some reflection after the experience to see, hey, what does that mean, and how can we use it, and all those types of things. But again, from a European perspective, they just didn't know. They're interpreting it based on their religion, their beliefs, and if they're encountering these individuals who are doing things they've never seen before, they're just trying to make sense of what they're seeing. This is one of the examples I think might have been illustrated by a native and a European, because you see the kind of the hooked feet, the claws. But the object here is believed to be a mushroom. And we know that the Psilocybe psychoactive mushrooms, they stain blue. Green was reserved as a really special, for really special things. It was a very important color. And so to designate those objects with the color green means that they were important. And there is belief that this represents Zapotecorum. Another of the mushrooms has been incorporated into artwork. Xochipelli was the god of flowers, but the interpretation of flowers is mushrooms, right? And so this image, this statue, has a stylized image of various psychoactive plants, but also fungi. And so you see mushroom caps on the knees and in the ears. But all these other psychoactive plants are around the body as well. And I was surprised that this is actually on display in Washington, D.C. I think the original is in a museum in Mexico. But so Aztecorum. And here you see that stylized image, and it's on the knees of the statue. And the other thing I've learned with some of the research, the statue is actually wearing a mask. And so mythologically, masks have a very special place. But to show a god wearing a mask is kind of interesting. Just a couple other examples, not Psilocybe. And some of the distortion is believed to be maybe symbolic of the effects of Amanita muscaria. Now, you don't see Amanita a lot, and mainly because it wasn't readily available. In those regions, Psilocybe is very present. All right? Amanita muscaria would be seasonal, so they'd have to either find it and save it, or to go, only wait for the season to find it. And so you don't see a ton of Amanita in this group. All right, so from here we're going to move a little bit more to the contemporary, look a little bit at some of Gordon Wasson's contributions. And so Gordon Wasson was a banker, right, businessman, and he married a Russian-American doctor, and she had her family, her culture had a lot of mushroom knowledge. And it really shocked him on their honeymoon when he saw her collecting them and wanting to eat them. He thought she would die. But nonetheless, she helped introduce him to mushrooms and helped him learn that there's more to it. And they together really started focusing on the cultural practices around the world with mushrooms. And so I do want to mention his wife. Gordon Wasson's Life magazine article always gets the publicity, but a week after his account was published in the magazine, she had an account published in a newspaper insert. What do they call it? A newspaper? Well, it was a newspaper publication, right? Where she talked about some of the effects and some of her experiences. And being a doctor, she was a pediatrician. She had belief that there was a lot of psychiatric potential. She knew that there was something about these mushrooms that might be useful for medicine. And so I think we definitely have to acknowledge her contributions as well. This is a pretty recent publication. It's a graphic novel that kind of focuses on the Wassons. And you can find it on Amazon and some of the bookstores, but it's a really kind of neat graphic novel presentation of their experience. And so Wasson gets a lot of credit, But I think the important thing to understand, he wasn't the first. You know, he didn't really start going down to Mexico until the early 50s. His first rituals he just observed. It wasn't until later that he actually went and consumed the mushroom. So he's given credit for being the first Westerner to consume them, but he wasn't the first to learn about them or to look for them, right? There were people even at the turn of the century, 1900, who were down looking for these things as well. And so Wasson gets a lot of credit, but he wasn't the first. It's just the image of some of the curandero, the shaman, who was present at the first ritual Wasson attended. And so Life magazine in 1957 got published and really opened the rest of the world's eyes to what was going on. Maria Sabina was introduced under a pseudonym. He named her Eva Mendez. And mainly because she said, hey, if you want to, I'll help you, I'll show you this, but I don't want you to tell anybody. And I don't want you to take my picture and share this with anybody. And so some of the criticism Wasson gets is because he really violated that trust. You know, and even though he changed her name, once the pictures got published, people recognized some of the clothing, some of the locations, and it caused more people to want to go there. All right, but here we have the first Western accounts of spiritual uses of these mushrooms, and again, the term magic mushroom is something that resulted. And so, if you can find an original edition of it, so they're pretty expensive, but I mean, you can find this stuff online and just read the articles as well. And so, not only did he introduce the practice, he also provided a field guide. And so showing people what to look for made more people interested, and it drew a lot of attention to this region in Oaxaca, and all kinds of people went down to look for him. All right, one last little kind of a trivial thing. There was a lot of conspiracy about Gordon Wasson working for the CIA. There was a CIA group who was focused on learning how psychoactive chemicals can be of benefit for government purposes, and they actually used a chemist as a front man to go with Wasson or to connect with Wasson. And so as a chemist, he was interested in the properties, but he was really working for the CIA. They gave Wasson money to do the trips and to go on these expeditions. And so this CIA agent really did help, or did go with Wasson, and eventually got samples to give to the government. Some of the accounts I've read, Wasson didn't think too much of this guy. I mean, the guy got sick on the trip and he complained a lot, and Wasson just thought he was a pain in the neck, so he's like, I don't want anything to do with this guy. And so some of the reflection, I do want to read this, and so we're going to see Gordon Wasson's thoughts, but also Maria Sabina's ideas or attitudes. And so Wasson says, what an amazing thing that we should all be carrying this inventory of wonder around us, ready to be tripped into our conscious world by mushrooms. In Maria Sabina's words, it's true that Wasson and his friends were the first foreigners who came to our town to search of the saint children, and that they didn't take them because they suffered from any illness. The reason they came was to find God. Before Wasson, nobody took the mushrooms to find God. They were always taken for the sick to get well. And that's one of the problems here, all right? So Wasson introduced this. People start looking for using these mushrooms for other reasons. The traditional use would be to solve problems, to help people. I've even read some accounts where they were taking mushrooms to find lost objects and to foretell the future, and even something that might be described as remote viewing, actually going to locations and seeing what's there without being there, But once the Westerners come in, they're using them for other purposes. And so Wasson did publish numerous ethnomycological works, and these are some of the titles that helped me with some of the research that I've done. And so a lot of his contributions really indirectly influenced this psychedelic renaissance that we're seeing now. And it's kind of interesting. I'm a straight-laced banker is the cause of all of this. All right, so we're going to look into Maria Sabina a bit. So Maria Sabina was Mazatec, and she only spoke that language. She didn't speak Spanish. She was considered a healer, or a curandera, shaman, right? And I think one of her biggest claims to fame is that she introduced the Western world to the entheogenic use of mushrooms. And this was all something that she really resisted, and ultimately she never benefited at all from it. She was really scorned by her community. Her house was burned down. She died in poverty. She didn't benefit anything from what happened. And so this account, I want to read it as well. This kind of goes into when she became a shaman. And I think the language that she uses, it's almost poetry, the way she speaks. But this account is how she came to learn the knowledge from the mushrooms. And so it starts, the secret that the mushrooms revealed to me are enclosed in a big book that the mushrooms showed to me. My sister Anna Maria, years before, fell ill. I loved my sister, and I took many more mushrooms than I'd ever taken before. At one point, a sprite came towards me. He asked a strange question. "But what do you wish to become, you, Maria Sabina?" I answered him without thinking that I wished to become a saint. And then the spirit smiled, and immediately he had in his hands something that was not there before, a big book with many written pages. My soul was entering the world of the mushrooms, and I was seeing landscapes in the deepest depths of their world. And it was as though I'd become richer, wiser, and in a moment I learned millions of things. And I think the fact that she even references a book, this was a woman who was illiterate, right? But she was shown a book by the mushrooms, and it helped her gain knowledge, right? And I think the accounts I've heard about this, that she consumed like 30 pairs of mushrooms, which is a pretty big quantity. And just to think where she went in that experience is just fascinating. What she learned and how she became who she was. And so I think I mentioned before, when we look at her example, hers is just one of many varieties of practices. And so the things I'm going to focus on are her practice, her style, her technique, which was referred to as a velada. And a velada is really like a ceremony, right? And in her case, it incorporated music and chanting, and other times, other practices might involve silence, And so there was a lot of variety of these ceremonies, but in her case, she used music. And so for Wasson, her ceremony was one of two that he observed himself. And so I think it always starts with intention. They had to have a worthy reason. And this is also where Wasson gets a little criticism, because he claimed that he was sick. And it was like a skin condition or something, he wanted help with. He also claimed that his son was lost, but his son was at school somewhere, and he said he wanted to find him. So he kind of came under false pretense, but that kind of gives him a little bit of a bad name. All right. In her case, the mushroom would be taken in pairs by the shaman. How much they took would depend on the species, and species was dependent on availability and location, and so that would vary depending on the reason for the ceremony. And the shaman would decide whether or not individuals could take them as well. And so people didn't. The people who were seeking the help didn't always consume the mushrooms. Mushrooms were eaten fresh and raw, sometimes ground up and taken with water. In all the accounts I've seen, it's very rare that they would be taken dried, and they believed that the potency would be lost if they were dried, and so fresh mushrooms were always preferred. Some of the other essentials: in darkness, at night. They wanted to be in areas that were away from people. There were monitors, people who watched and didn't consume the mushrooms, just who took care of the people who were going through the experiences. The other thing, there were rules. And this is another piece that kind of discouraged Maria Sabina once Westerners got involved, because they didn't practice the rules. They didn't follow the rules that they required. And then the idea about where the information comes from, it's the mushroom that's doing the talking, all right? The shaman is just a vehicle for that, for the mushroom to speak. And so the mushrooms are the ones who are doing the communicating. Some other images. This is a pretty famous work of Wasson and his wife, but they illustrate some of the mushrooms. Other accessories. And some of these objects were maybe more for ceremonial purposes: candles, eggs, incense. And then just a diagram of where the ceremony that Wasson participated in. And the thing that's kind of interesting, there were children present. This was like a family experience. It wasn't something that was hidden. Some of the research I've been doing lately, it talks about children doses versus adult doses. And so children will be given mushrooms in some cases as well. Just another image. All right, so I am going to play this. I'm going to play one track of the ceremony here, I think it's nice that Wasson recorded this. And so what you're going to hear is one song sung by Maria Sabina in her Mazatec language. I have the interpretation for you so you can kind of see what she's saying, but this would be one of many songs that were sung during the ceremony. Let's see if I can get that. I gotta get my audio. And so when you look at the words, it's really poetry. Her words, she's a poet. And you will also see that there are some elements of Christianity which their culture did incorporate, but they're not necessarily, it's not a religious ceremony. It's a spiritual ceremony for sure, but not necessarily a religious ceremony. So let me see if I can get the audio.
Nato, chonga toki nato, chonga yinya nato, happy choki nato, chonga pando nato, chonga pando nato, chonga sanda nato, chonga kase nato, chonga pando nato, chonga pibito nato, happy choki nato, chonga pibito nato. Trong an ca say na tô, trong si đi tô nha tô, trong an ca say nha tô, trong gặp mình say nha tô, trong gặp đi say nha tô, trong gặp tay nát nha tô, hai cái số bi na tô, trong an ca xoan na tô, trong an ca nhà na tô, trong an ca say na tô, trong si đi tô na tô, hai cái to te na to, haki so kri na to, chonga ka na to, chonga pa yon na to, haki so kri na to, chonga to kri na to, haki so si na to, chonga ri don ni to, chonga ti se ni to, haki so kri ni to, chinga ti se ni to, chonga ti da ni to, asenga ti se ni to, asenga ti da 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 ni to, haki so kri ni to, ha so si ni to, haki so kri ni to, ha so si ni to, hi na ai la sa bi na ni to, hi nghe sa to so hi nghe sa ta to, hai âm ni to sa to ni to sa ta ni to, sa to shi sa to shi sa ta shi sa to shi sa ta sa to sa ta, shi sa to mi và shi sa ta mi, qua shi sa to mi và shi sa ta mi.
So that's just one of the songs that was part of the velada that she would perform. And, you know, they'd sing a song, then they'd take a break, maybe smoke a cigarette, talk about things, then they'd pick it back up. And this would go on for 7 or 8 hours. So unfortunately, her image has really become the stereotype of the mushroom shaman, all right? And you do see some kind of negative things. You see a lot with smoking, and they make it seem like it's like marijuana, but I mean, you smoke tobacco. So you see a lot of this, and it's really kind of takes away from really the importance that she did serve. Some are a little bit better. But she has become kind of the spokesperson for the mushrooms. Just some different artwork. But I do think when you see her words, I mean, she's a poet with language. There's another artwork. This was an image drawn by Naomi Salzman. She's Manny Salzman's daughter. This was actually the first year I attended the Telluride Mushroom Festival, but really, really neat designs. And she incorporated a mushroom stone and also Wasson and Maria Sabina, their encounter. And so one last piece with her, I mean, part of it's Wasson's reflection on what happened, but also Maria Sabina giving her perspective on what she felt. And she says, before Wasson, I felt that the saint children elevated me. I don't feel like that anymore. The forces had diminished. If Kenyaho Cayetano hadn't brought the foreigners, the saint children would have kept their power. From the moment the foreigners arrived, the saint children lost their purity. They lost their force, and the foreigners spoiled them. From now on, they won't be any good. There's no remedy for it. And so Wasson's response, or his reflection, was, these words make me wince. I, Gordon Wasson, am held responsible for the end of a religious practice in Mesoamerica that goes back far for millennia. I fear she spoke the truth, exemplifying her wisdom. A practice carried on in secret for centuries has now been aerated, and aeration spells the end. So I do think you get a sense that he had some remorse for maybe exposing or sharing something he shouldn't necessarily have shared. And so he did have feel some responsibility. All right, so to kind of wrap things up a bit, some of the contemporary thoughts. We see a lot of research now that tries to look at the benefits of psilocybin. Now, the thing we have to keep in mind when you look at these studies, they're done in a clinical setting, and they're using synthetic compounds, all right? Mainly because you can regulate the dose with a synthetic versus giving somebody mushroom. There's no telling how much of a compound would be in there, all right? But nonetheless, the results that they're finding are pretty promising. This was one of the first studies for the more recent era where they found that psilocybin can help encourage mystical experiences. And the thing that's interesting with these first studies, they used drug-naive individuals, people who never used drugs. And some of these people were responding that these were the most significant experiences of their life, you know, ranking up there with their children being born and their marriages and things like that. And so the fact that science is now getting back to where they were in the late 60s is kind of encouraging. And we see very credible sources that are promoting, or not promoting, but sharing information. The American Psychological Association, if you search psychoactive or psychedelic therapies, you'll find more information. Psychology Today. And just the fact that they're starting to realize that there are many conditions that could benefit from the use of these compounds. This was one I thought was interesting. The term microdosing comes up a lot. And this was actually from a Marine Corps publication, so it was a military publication. But their belief or their idea was that maybe psilocybin could be like a performance-enhancing drug for soldiers. And even the comment here, the use of cognitive PEDs to increase productivity, creativity, problem-solving ability, and flow. And so just the idea that more people are realizing that there is potential, and maybe this is something we should consider or look into. This was some of the research published by Johnson and Griffiths. These are the Johns Hopkins researchers. And here they're just kind of going over some of the research that's out there and looking at some of the conditions that may benefit from the use of psilocybin. This was another one that more recently was just published, and looking at how treatment of alcoholism can be used, or psilocybin can be used for that. And so I think just knowing that these chemicals, these compounds do have potential. I mean, that's encouraging, because there's a lot of people out there who might benefit from these things, you know, and just knowing that maybe someday they will be available is encouraging. This is the current proposition, and there's mixed feelings here. You know, I think so on the ballot in November. There is an initiative or a proposition where people want to decriminalize psychoactive plants in Colorado. Some things you got to understand with this particular proposition, it came from an outside group. This group was not from Colorado. And there is question about what their motivations really are because of the language of how it's worded. So if you're interested in this, I would look at the information a little bit more. All right, and finally, most of this research I did during COVID, and I came across this interesting one when we were all locked down. But the caption, or why are people taking mushrooms during the lockdown? I mean, a lot of people were looking for help, looking for something. And the quote here: as the COVID generation turns to mushrooms in the hope of being guided to a better place, it's clear psilocybin has the potential to be a powerful teacher. Whether it's bringing people deeper into a state of harmony with their bodies and the relationships with those around them, or out into a greater understanding of the world around us. And so just thinking that in challenging times, maybe there is potential for these substances. All right. And just lastly, I mean, the references that I mentioned, but also the QR code where you can access this stuff if you want it. The link would take it to the slides themselves, or at least a version of the slide. I'll update it. I'll also add a link to another a presentation I gave with this, but that's there if you want it. So, thank you.
Thank you. Great.